Welcome, everyone. I'm Ann Petrick, Senior Director of Research at Vistage. I'm happy to host the latest webinar in the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion series in our Peak Performer webinar series. The series is designed to support your leadership climb by bringing the most trusted experts to the Vistage community. Experts who provide exceptional insight and best practices, helping you navigate new challenges and opportunities. The question is, are we wired for bias? This is something we'll explore in this groundbreaking presentation about our defensive brains and implicit bias. Learning to recognize our biases will unlock our potential to be more inclusive leaders. Today's presentation will cover foundational information about the brain, thinking tendencies, and biases in everyday life. We've invited Joelle Martinez, President and CEO of Latino Leadership Institute, to join us today. Joelle is a nationally recognized executive, strategist, speaker, and facilitator. As a visionary leader, Joelle dedicates her life to helping cross-sector leaders realize their individual potential, as well as the economic and social opportunities presented by an increasingly diverse U.S. populace. Now, prior to LLI, Joelle spent more than 15 years building winning communications, business development, and public affairs strategies in both private and public sectors. She's also a subject matter expert in NeuroLeadership, Latino identity, civic engagement, workplace diversity and inclusion, as well as demographic shifts. Welcome, Joelle. Let's turn it over to you.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Vistage, for having me be a part of your Peak Performance webinar series. I have a lot of content to cover, so I'm going to get right in. Today's presentation, as Anne talked about, is actually going to be broken down into a couple different parts. Before I get into bias and really understanding why we think understanding how we're wired is critical to really moving DE&I forward in our companies, organizations, and our communities, I'm going to actually start with laying some foundation around diversity, equity, and inclusion. We often throw those words around, they're big concepts, so I'm going to help us build on a foundation of what is DE&I and why does it matter to all of us. Building on that foundation, we'll talk a little bit about the brain, unwiring the brain, understanding how the brain works, and why it is instrumental in unlocking our inclusive leadership tendencies, practices, and skills and behaviors. Then we'll close out by looking at a couple biases that we can all relate to because we all have them. And then at the end, I'm going to show you a little bit about the work that we're doing at Vistage to help leaders really unlock their full inclusive potentials. So let's get into today's presentation. Again, the first part of today's presentation is really going to be understanding the foundations of what it is we're talking about when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. But the first place I want to start is the motivation. What brings Vistage, what brings our other partners and individuals to this conversations? I have two main factors that I think are critically important for the moment that we're living in. The first comes down to demographic shifts that are taking place in the country. We know because we just got the 2020 census results. As business owners, as leaders, we're kind of mining through this data to try to decide what does this data mean to us. And what it means to us is that over the next couple of decades, we're going to see massive diversification of not only the United States, but of our workforce. And that is going to begin to happen quite rapidly. At about 2025, we really start seeing that amp up. So it behooves us to be prepared for those demographic shifts, for the great diversity that's going to be in our workforce, in our leadership, and in our society. What 2020 showed us, though, the census, is that, first of all, the pace of diversification is not slowing at all, but the growth in population is. And that's why really understanding diversity and equity and inclusion is critically important for business owners today. We're already talking about employee crunches and recruitment and retention of employees. Well, what's going to happen in the future is that your employee base, who you're going to recruit from, is going to look more and more diverse. So some of the thinking and the skill sets that we're working to develop today within leaders is going to help them really connect with their future workforce and make sure that when they do come to work for their companies, they know that they belong there. The other key point that came out of this census I want to share with you today is a younger generation's perspective on what diversity is. It's really important as I share terms and ideas and concepts with you that you understand that some of these things are constantly in flux. The younger generation that replied to the census this year are redefining what diversity actually means. You had about a 300% increase in younger individuals identifying as multiracial. What that tells us as we're preparing leaders around DE&I is we're going to have to continue to expand our understanding of what it is when we talk about diversity. So the first motivation is the sheer fact that our country is becoming more diverse by the day. The second motivation is where our aspirations are not in line with our reality today. So we have been working as a society on DE&I since the mid-1960s. And yet today, regardless of all of the work that's been put into DE&I, about 70% of all leadership still remains white men. And why this matters so much is because we have relied on policies, procedures, at times even legislation to try to move the DE&I needle. And we here at LLI just don't think that that is enough. I ask you to think about maybe some of the challenges that you may experience in achieving your aspirations to create more diversity and inclusion in your own companies. So we have the second motivation. We haven't quite met our goals and aspirations as a society around DE&I. So what is it that we're talking about? Why am I going to talk to you about the brain and bias? Well, there are many definitions about diversity, equity, and inclusion out there today. I use these in the work that we do to develop inclusive leaders. Really, quite simply, diversity is what we see. It's what we can count. It's what we can put scorecards around. It's if we're looking at a table, a boardroom, an executive leadership team, it's being able to see and count that there are a lot of different perspectives and backgrounds in the room. Equity is really what has to be done. It is the effort, it is the policies, it is the work, it is the systems and structures that are in place to remove any barriers or any roadblocks that may exist for individuals to serve in those positions. Inclusion is really about a feeling. It's about when you are there, when you've been invited, when you've been included at that table, that you're really being able to bring your full unique self to the table. So your thoughts, your perspectives, your backgrounds, and you know it when you achieve that. Ultimately, what we do with our leaders through our development work is try to create cultures of belonging, because belonging is the outcome. And we all know it. We know when we fit in, we know when we belong, and when we do, we're able to contribute. We're bringing innovation and ideas, as we'll see later on the ROI factor. So just for a moment, think about this. Think about your own career. We've all had moments in our career where we knew we just didn't feel like we belonged. Maybe we walked into a room and we were, the youngest person in the room at the time. Maybe we were the only one with an accent in the room. Maybe we were the only woman in the room. Not only think about that moment in your career, but take a moment to think about how it impacted you in the moment. The confidence or lack thereof you might have had. How did it impact your work? Were you as willing to share your big, bold ideas, your solutions to problems? Data shows probably not. That's our motivation as leaders, is to create that sense of belonging. Now, why haven't we been able to achieve this goal? And this really sets us up to talk about the brain and the science behind the work we do. We as a society, again, have relied on policies, procedures, legislations, and ambition to create ultimate goals and achievement around DE&I. If we trace this back to the 1960s, we had the civil rights movement really kicking off this work around diversity, equity, and inclusion. The outcome of that were things like affirmative action, which was a requirement, a quota system to make sure that we had diversity. But affirmative action did not make us feel like we belonged anymore. It just made sure that we had access to something. So it was a step, but it didn't have the full puzzle piece. We had the EEOC, which really helped protect employees and give some framework to employers to make sure that they weren't, creating any injustices or unfairness within the workplace based on someone's background. And all of this was built on a mentality of the great melting pot, meaning that people were going to give up their individual identities in order to fit into a company or an organization. But what happened in the 1970s and 1980s, more women came into the workforce was beginning to come a little bit more and more diverse. And all of a sudden, we had a new framework of thinking, and multiculturalism began to become kind of the term of the decade. And so we first then began to expand our understanding of diversity. It was at first really gender-based, and now all of a sudden we're looking at religion, we're looking at sexual orientation and other dimensions of one's identity that we're lumping into diversity. And by the 1990s, we probably all experienced that we began to have infrastructure around this, resource groups, maybe vice presidents of diversity and inclusion. Maybe you had, folks that were managing portfolios just to build diversity within an organization. And this is where we really seed the roots of what we're going to be talking about today. Because in the 1990s and early 2000s, another layer really came onto this work, and that is the science of it. Many people began to say, why are we not moving the needle? And what we found is what I'm going to share with you today, is because we had a major roadblock in the path to progress, and that was individuals. That we could have ambitions and goals, and we could set policies and procedures in order that we're strategically aligned with those goals. But the individuals whom are responsible for executing those things, for creating the cultures of belonging, for really eliminating bias in the system, were still bringing their biases to the system. So we would see systems fail or systems fall short. So the work that we do at the LLI is bringing in this science-based approach into DE&I. So what we have taken is what we know about the brain, what we know about neuroscience, and what we know about kind of these systemic programmings that need to happen alongside of the way that we are wired in order to really move progress of DE&I forward. Strategies, rethinking about how we're going to approach D&I, not from a compliance standpoint, because compliance hasn't worked for us, but really one from an invitation of contributing to creating a sense of belonging within organizations. So what I'm going to present to you this morning and today on this Friday is the root of this neuroscience work, the root of really understanding how do we unlock our full potential to be inclusive leaders. And it starts with understanding bias and the bias that each one of us bring to DE&I work. So the first piece of this puzzle of unlocking and understanding our biases is understanding the functions and the knowledge that we've gained through neuroscience since 2005, when this really began to be a framework, what we have learned about the brain. And so there's these 6 key insights that drive our understanding of bias. And the first is that the brain is a connection machine. Earlier today, we were talking about the cell phone. Think about this. The amount of information that is on your cell phone today could have filled up a Radio Shack store in the 1990s, a video recorder, a music, a stereo system, a TV, a computer, the early stage computers. Well, now all of that exists on a phone in our hand that we can hold and have access to. Our brain is far undersized for the amount of information that we process, retain, and act on in a given day. So in order to make decisions, as I'm going to show you, we make quick connections in our brain. The second factor is that no two brains are alike. As you'll see when I talk about the different parts of the brain, our limbic system, this middle part of our brain, is based on memories and emotions. And since no one has lived my life, your brain won't look exactly like mine. The brain also hardwires almost everything it can. To the first point, the brain is just undersized for the amount of information it processes. So it likes to use our unconscious thinking and hardwiring thing with almost every decision that we make. But that hardwiring, it drives our automatic perception. And we think we have control of our perceptions. We think we have control of the way we see, that we're somehow every single time we're confronted with something, we're able to use logic or rationale. And what the neuroscience has told us is, in fact, we don't. And I'm going to show you that here in a minute. And the other thing we know is that it's almost impossible to undo any of the hardwiring that we have in our brain. And that's why the sixth insight is so critically important and what our program is really built around. Is if I can't take all of that old biases, hardwiring, perceptions, and stereotypes out, what do I need to do to build new thinking in so that I can be an effective, inclusive leader? So some of the details around the brain look like this. First of all, it really starts with this idea is that until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our life and call it fate. Let me show you what that means in data form. So when do you think you formed your first stereotype about people? How old do you think you were? Can you remember the moment that you were beginning to see someone and tell a whole story about them in a matter of seconds? You might be surprised to find out that we as human beings actually began to create stereotypes at a very young age. In fact, science shows us that it's around ages 3 and 5 that we began to categorize people based on race, based on gender, based on religion. We get these stories told to us and implanted in our head, and we begin to hardwire them through the books we read, what's on the news while our parents are, watching the television, what our parents are talking about. If you take a moment and you think of what your life was like as a preschooler and then later on in elementary school, it's likely that you could have grown up in a household that had very, very deep-rooted racism, sexism, misogyny. Maybe you grew up in a very religious household and you weren't really allowed to be open-minded about other religions. The point of this is that the root of our bias is actually dates far back and is actually deeply wired into the brain, starting at a very young age. And this is why this is so critically important, because the brain really has 3 different parts to it, right? There's 3 different elements to the brain. The first part of the brain back here, this is our reptilian brain. These are the systems are all a go type part of the brain. They're instinctual, they control our breathing, our balance, eyesight, things that we are not having to consciously be aware of, but is keeping us operational. The second part of the brain as it evolved though, is the mammalian brain. And this is what I was talking about earlier. This is the center part of the brain, also known as the limbic system. In this part of the brain is where we have control of our hormones, where our memories live, where our emotions are stored. The third part of the brain is the prefrontal cortex or the neocortex of the brain. This is the one part of the brain that is actually conscious, where rationale and logic play in. So how often are we using our logical brain versus our emotional brain? How often, what percentage do we think all of our decisions are based on emotion alone? Well, it turns out that over 80% of all of our decisions that we make in a single day are based on emotion alone. And that of all the decisions we made, only about 5% of them are done so consciously in that prefrontal cortex, logical, rational, or sometimes called system 2 thinking. Now, why is it so important for us as we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging to understand that as human beings, we are still operating in an unconscious space? Why is it so important for us to really understand how our emotions are driving us in the work that we do around DE&I? Well, it's because our brain is wired as a great alarm system. You see, the basic function of the brain is to keep us alive, is to make sure that we have enough information to keep our systems up and to keep us safe from our environment. So in order to do so, our brain takes every decision, every thought, every perception that we're trying to move through it, and it says, is this good for me? Reward, I'm safe, or is this a threat? Do I have to run away? And the brain automatically, without us having control over it, minimizes any threats or dangers or fears, and it maximizes anything that we think is good for us. And this is the organizing principle of our brain. I can't think of many topics that have threat and fear, emotions so deeply rooted and tied to it as conversations around racism, sexism, genderism, right? Conversations about religion and perception, conversations about systemic barriers that exist and are perpetuated. At its very root, DE&I is so difficult to address because it is so emotionally charged. And our alarm system, even when I walk into a room and I say, I'm here to talk about DE&I, automatically triggers most brains to be in the state of danger, the state of threat. So it's really hard to not invite people, to be able to invite people in and keep them there, when automatically the way our brains are wired is to maybe keep us away from some of these topics. So each day, every day that we are operating in these spaces, each day that we are thinking about our being inclusive leaders, in the background are these biases. So we have, from a very early age, 3-5, we started creating perceptions and stereotypes about people. By the time we hit middle school, our framework and how we see other individuals was pretty much solidified and hardwired. By middle school, our brain, kind of shuts off its new thinking pathways in that way that are emotionally charged. And so as we as adults go into this work of DE&I, we have to really understand that the biases that we are holding are not necessarily based on how we're living our lives today or the input and information that we're getting today. They're really about some of our experiences very early on in our childhood. And even though we'd like to believe that those biases don't percolate around today, science shows us that they do. So let's call out a couple of these biases that are really solidified. And during this part of my presentation, I really want to invite you in. I'm going to do some pausing because I really want you, if you have a pen and paper, to do a little bit of self-reflection in this space. Because these biases, again, going to that, the unconscious conscious, if we don't begin to call them out, then they are going to continue to percolate and really get in our way of being inclusive leaders. So let's look at the first one for what we know. And again, you're seeing this model, this brain functional principle organizing model of threat and reward, avoid and approach. So the first bias that we see a lot in everyday society is what is called the affinity bias. Sometimes it's known as a them versus us. In other words, what the brain is doing is it's scanning for things that make us comfortable. And it's absolutely firing off on all cylinders when something is different, right? We're uncomfortable. Again, our natural inclination when something is uncomfortable to us is to actually move away to avoid. So we want to minimize danger and maximize reward. Affinity bias looks like this. I just happen to be from Denver, Colorado, and as you can see behind me, obviously a very loyal Denver Broncos fan. Affinity bias can be as harmless as me being in a crowded casino in Vegas, for example, and seeing someone across the room with a Denver Broncos hat and me feeling comfortable enough to start up a conversation about the offensive line, right? I don't know this person. My only data point in being able to assess them is that we have a similarity around our love for all things Bronco. So now I'm putting, because of that simple fact, this individual into a safe category. I'm willing to approach, right? But if that individual, let's say, had a Raiders hat on in Las Vegas, as I'm sure there's more of now, I'm more likely to never engage in a conversation, right? There is no connection there. There's no similarity. So I'm likely to avoid it altogether and have no interest in that. In the workplace, this plays out significantly in hiring people and recruitment processes. One of the most influential components of hiring someone is their alma mater, where they went to school. And if you happen to attend the same university as I did, all of a sudden, I'm going to feel connected to you. I'm going to see your good qualities, which leads into the halo horn effect, which means that if I have a similarity with you, I'm going to overextend the grace I give you, the interest I have in you. But if you went to the opposite university or are big rivals, I'm maybe going to be looking for those bad qualities out of you. And we are not in control of these things. These things are happening again in our unconscious thinking. So again, I'm going to give you a couple minutes here to just, write down some thoughts. I want you to think of a time when you met someone and you found out that they were from your hometown, let's say, or maybe your alma mater. What were some of those connections? What were some of those first impressions that you had of this individual after they told you that they went to either your school or were from your hometown? And just write that down if you can think of a specific instance where that took place. The second bias that I really want to address kind of plays off of the first one of the affinity bias, and it's called the primacy effect. Again, this is all coming down to first impressions, how we see people from the get-go. And what we know is it takes 1/10 of a second for us to make a whole judgment call. When my camera got turned on today and you saw me for the first time, you were probably making up a whole story about me. We do it with everyone we encounter. Why the primacy effect is so important when we think about bias is because it goes back to that brain needing to attach itself to something, and it needs to make it stick. And so our brain likes to create these shortcuts. And so we leverage this primacy effect in order to create these shortcuts, to not invest too much time, so that we avoid using logic and reason, because we need to conserve our brain's energy. So we lever this primacy effect to create these first impressions. Why the primacy effect is so dangerous for us as we're trying to create inclusive, belonging cultures is because once we create that first impression, it's nearly impossible to undo it. It's crazy to think that 1/10 of a second could set course on an entire relationship. That is not to say that over time as we get more familiar with people, we open up to them and maybe we undo some of those initial impressions. But what we find in data and neuroscience is that once that impression is seated in our brains, it's almost impossible to let it go. And so the biases, as it connects to our affinity bias, to constantly scanning, is this good for me? Is this bad for me? We are, again, unconsciously looking for these cues, telling full stories, and then embedding them in our brain. And it makes it very, very challenging for us to overcome those things. The other bias that I want to talk about just for a minute before I get into insight to inclusive leadership is known as confirmation bias. And we do a lot of work with Vistage, with chairs, with the employees. I'll talk about that in just a second. But what we find is that even when we make it past affinity bias and we could really begin to identify how that bias is percolating in our interactions with people, or maybe understanding how affinity bias then is tapped into our primacy bias, and these two things together really make it difficult for us to connect with people that are different than us, that speak a different language, that have a different culture, that have a different faith. One of the other biases that plays in the background is called confirmation bias, something that especially as us as leaders, as professionals, we use often. That we scan the world for things that prove our point. Makes it easy for us, right? Again, we want to avoid threat. We want to avoid any challenge in life by natural human beings. That's just how we're wired to do. So layered, once we have the affinity and primacy bias, we have this confirmation bias that comes in, sets those things kind of in stone, and then really prevents us from having an open mind when we're looking for a different perspective, right? When we're looking to change those biases. So when we were working with individuals and organizations about how to create programming that would really create, again, that optimal outcome so we can actually meet goals and ambitions and aspirations around DE&I, we took a step back and we said, what is it we're trying to solve? What is it that is truly preventing us from being inclusive leaders? And it came down to this one simple answer, that the memories and emotions that we locked in at such a young age in our life are kind of tapped down. We don't call them out. We don't take the time to do some self-awareness work. We don't take the time to really explore how we get in the way of good policies and procedures, that we have a tendency to go right back to our old habits, behaviors, and thinking, even when maybe we're inspired by a presentation. Why is it that by the next day, we're right back to our same thinking? So we went back to our partners. We worked with an amazing researcher out of the University of Colorado Leeds School of Business, Dr. Stephanie Johnson. And we said, we can unlock the full potential of diversity by creating inclusive leaders with a neuroscience perspective. How do we bring the context and the science together? And what we created was Insight to Inclusive Leadership. This is the work that we're doing with Vistage today. Everything I've talked about, the history of DE&I, the root of our unconscious thinking, our unconscious decision-making in full play, and our defensive brains actually preventing us from leaning into this work led us to a new model. If we think about diversity again, having this diverse perspective around the table, we use the S.E.A.T model. Our goal is to bring more of that to the table and have those individuals, when they arrive, feel as though they belong. So how do we create that? What is it that we're talking about today? The first is self-awareness. Often people come to this work not even understanding or realizing how stereotypes and perceptions are truly navigating us through this space of DE&I. We don't take enough stock in our own challenges and barriers as it relates to how do we become a more inclusive leader. My own journey around this is personal because we all have our unique things, but it really came to light when I started doing my own self-awareness work. And that was two things came up for me. One, I grew up in a very Catholic family. I went to Catholic school my whole life. One of the challenges I had was really connecting with the LGBTQ plus community. You know, for so long, I'm taught what's right and what's wrong. So it wasn't until one of my cousins came out and we as a family really had to unpack that. And most of the family would not accept it. Some of the family did. And I thought that I had overcome that, right? I thought I had understood that that was part of my story. But as I grew up into my adult years and my leadership years, it still became a blind spot for me. I realized that in my own diversity comfort zone, I hadn't widened it enough to include members of the LGBTQ plus community to really have what the second piece is of this model, and that is empathy. I can aspire to be inclusive, and I can aspire to be more welcoming and open-minded. But until I really make those deep connections with other individuals and other perspectives, I haven't actually created empathy. And empathy is absolutely required to be an inclusive leader. And we can't actually create empathy until one, we've identified some of these biases, and two, we've done the hard work to bringing more of that perspective, experience, and identity layers directly to us, experiencing those on a regular basis. The third element of this work is the activation piece. You can't just want inclusion to happen. We have to be actively involved day in and day out, working to identify our biases and creating new thinking around those biases. We have to be open to new perspectives. We have to actively engage with folks that may be outside of our diversity comfort zones. And when we do all of these things, we create a new foundation of trust. And trust is absolutely essential in dealing with the alarm system. Because even if we're not yet quite comfortable with all the diversity around the table, If we have trust, it diminishes that fear threat signal that's going off, and it allows us to stay in that approach mode, going towards the work. So trust, we have found, is key in neuroscience to undo fear. And so we want to build trust so that we can eliminate the fear of difference in the room. So this program that we're doing with Vistage today, we've already worked with your chairs, your executive leadership team, I think senior leadership, and now are beginning to work with members, is really a 5-module program. The first, where we talk about diversity and all of its layers and complexities. The second, where we unpack equity and micro inequities and really tackle things like stereotypes and microaggressions. The third is where we really, today we barely scratched the surface on bias and the science of this and the limbic system and our memories and emotions as children and how they're playing into our adult leadership practices. The fourth one actually has a book called Inclusify, and each individual member actually will get an individual report about your strengths and potential follies as an inclusive leader. We'll look at things like meritocracy and how that plays into it, and things like allyship, something that's really important with DE&I work. And finally, building on the neuroscience, all of this is for naught if we don't actually teach ourselves how to create new habits and behaviors. Remember, it is nearly impossible to rewire and take away the wiring, that has been embedded in our brain for decades. So we have to be really intentional and really put forth a lot of effort in order to create this new wiring in our brain to be more inclusive. And I know I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but the ROI is significant for everything we talked about. Go back to that prompt of when you knew you did not belong. In that moment, I guarantee you didn't speak up as much. You didn't share your ideas. You didn't feel like you were part of the team and able to really contribute. You probably had questions about your value and worth at the organization. Maybe you were unhappy in the situation. Maybe you were even fearful. Well, the motivation to really overcome some of these barriers are things like being able to drive innovation, which increases revenue. Being able to really retain employees. We know how expensive it is to go out and recruit and train new employees. And so over and over again, the companies that create these sense of belonging are the companies that are seeing innovation and profit margins skyrocket. There's another piece to it too, that diversity, that diversification of our country is leading to new marketplaces. And so it behooves us all to have a reflective workforce and a reflective leadership team so that we can really understand and reach this new marketplace that we're all operating in today. I'll end on this note before I turn it over and before we do some Q&A. First of all, if you have any questions or curious about this work, you can always reach us at latinoslead.org. But I want to share a little bit about why this is so personal and why did we get into this space to begin with. Again, going back to the story of my own childhood and how that barrier and those biases still impact the way I was leading today. A couple of years ago, I was called out in a very, direct way because I had this blind spot, and I pushed back and I said, not me, not I. I'm an inclusive leader. I run the Latino Leadership Institute to build diversity and inclusion. And the individual looked me straight in the eye and said, can I invite you into a conversation around reality? And I sat and I listened and I heard and I was self-reflected. And then I put forth the work. And that was the seeds of this work, is that if we individually take it upon ourselves to do that self-assessment, to really understand our biases, to open up conversations, to build trust, then we have the foundation to apply those policies and practices and strategies. Not only will they be effective, they're going to be sustained. And what we find in DE&I in our research is that most organizations will start something, let it go for a little bit, they don't get the results fast enough, and so they abandon it. You're not going to abandon this work if you've personalized it, if it's about your own value, worth, and inclusive leadership potential. So with that, I want to thank you for your time and definitely want to open up to any questions you may have.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joe. I was fervently taking some notes. I have some great questions myself, so I'll start with those and invite everyone to submit questions through the Q&A pane in your Zoom toolbar. So you talked about the 5 areas of your program, and I was wondering which one of them represents the biggest challenge in DE&I work for small and mid-sized businesses today?
You know, we've actually received a lot of feedback even from your chairs on this, Anne, so I love this question. I think the hardest barrier here is the one around our own individual biases. When we talk about microaggressions or stereotypes, it's really hard to argue that when we go through the program. Maybe they're learning about them, maybe they learn to identify them more, but it's not so personal because it's happening kind of all over the place. But when we do work in module 3, which is really about your individual experience, and we talk about things like a diversity comfort zone, which by definition is, you know, kind of the diversity that we operate in and operate well in, people begin to realize that maybe their zone isn't as big as they thought it was, even later in their careers. And so that's a really important process, but because it's so personal and unique, it's also hard to train around because everyone's bringing something. I would also say the piece about our childhood. You know, we think in leadership and, you know, in general that we are rational, logical, we can take information and just act on that. And that's true in the short term, but long term, we really rely on those emotions and memories and context. And it's really powerful for people to connect how they were raised and what they grew up with the unconscious biases they still carry with them today. So that's probably the hardest work that takes place, but the most foundational.
So in that stage, when leaders become more inclusive and therefore have the ability, like you said, to implement policies, practices, and strategies, how much do they need to overcome the microaggressions of everyone else on their team? Is that part of what would make a successful effort?
Yeah. So I'm going to answer that question by taking a bit of a moment to talk about equity, because equity is so critically important. So what happens when we talk about equity is we actually focus in on these micro inequities that exist and persist for a lot of people, microaggressions being one of those micro inequities. And why that's so critically important is because the impact it has on the psychology and the confidence of your workforce and the people that are subjected to those microaggressions. Microaggressions often are talked about as being the death by 1,000 cuts. So nothing blatant, but these things are going to impact your confidence, your value, your worth, your sense of belonging. And so when we do work around microaggressions, it's not just understanding them and being able to identify them, but knowing the difference between the intent versus impact. Most people do not intend to hurt other people when they make a comment. So one of them, Anne, that I often use is after I get done doing one of my speeches, I guarantee you someone will come to me and say, wow, you are a great speaker. You're so articulate. They're paying me a compliment. I know this, but to me, the impact is I receive it as, I surprise them. I've even been told your English is great. And I say, I hope so. I'm a 9th generation Coloradan. So they're paying me a compliment. But again, their perceptions, their stereotypes manifest itself and it harms me. So when we do that work, to answer your question, it's about this recognition that we as a whole all have them. We all have stereotypes and perceptions. We all have potentially good intentions, but until we can understand and hear from other people the impact that our comments have, we don't really understand why this continues to be an equity barrier. So the module 2 is it's a real good exercise for us to realize we truly are all part of the problem and part of the solution.
So for someone that's not part of this program, what steps can you take to identify your blind spots? Are there assessments? How do you start to identify and uncover that? Because they truly are blind spots, right?
They are. So there's a couple really good books I would definitely suggest for individuals that are curious about this. Everyday Bias is a good book. The Sum of Us is another really good book that I think frames this work really well. There are, Harvard has the implicit bias test, which is available to anyone. You could take that online, just go to Harvard implicit bias and you'll find it. So there's definitely explore the curiosity. But what I find is find a safe friend or colleague or someone and just start having conversations about these topic matters. You don't even have to read a book. Just say, hey, have you ever heard about affinity bias? Do you think that is a real thing? And open up conversations in a safe space and then, kind of ease yourself into this.
It's like, can you talk about owners or CEOs leading this effort versus just participating in it? Would participants be less forthcoming if owners are part of the dialogue? So if the CEO is in the room with everybody else, would they actually be as honest and candid and transparent?
So I just had this conversation with a team in the NFL, and they wanted to start this program with middle management, and then they wanted it to be part of the onboarding, as anyone who would go through their work at their organization. And I said, absolutely not. That it really actually does start with the executive leadership team, and that is always our recommendation. Our experience is the way that we've built this program and how our facilitators are trained. The CEO being in the room, he's just as vulnerable. He's as required to be as open and transparent as everyone else. It actually creates kind of a level playing field around DE&I. So we've never actually confronted where just because the CEO is in the room, people are less willing to talk about it. And we'll talk to the leader, we'll talk to the CEO in advance. They've truly got to be open. They've got to be willing to do the work. And when they are, it's really impactful for their teams and organizations.
Yeah, well, I think Patrick Lencioni says that in the 5 dysfunctions of the team, building trust, the leader has to go first. So I think that's a great example of that.
And your own CEO, Sam, is obviously a big believer in 5 dysfunctions, and can say that Vistage led in that same way. So it's the power of that is undeniable.
So you talked about affinity bias and confirmation bias, but there's over a question we have here, over 188 cognitive biases mapped today. So how can leaders identify to recognize the ones affecting them and how the situation, crisis or growth can affect the way their biases manifest?
Yeah, I love that it's up to 188. I think it was 176 2 weeks ago. So it's a moving target. But yes, I'm going to answer that with a little bit more information though, because not all biases are equal. And we leverage some biases more than others. And there's 4 major reasons we have these biases: quick decisions, not enough information, safety reasons. There's these different reasons that we have them, and they fit into their compartments based on their function. For the purposes of inclusion work, though, there are just really a handful of biases, not all 176 or 188 that we're looking at. We're looking at biases that relate to how we perceive and interact with human beings, right? Some of these other biases won't really impact that one function. Our brain, from the very beginning in its evolution, was trained to kind of scan the universe around us and to keep a space. The fight or flight mentality was very basic in our evolution with our human brains. And so there's certain biases that live within that are directly connected to that function, directly connected to how we perceive in other people. So some of the other ones that I mentioned were, the halo horn effect. That's a big one that plays into some of our biases. And the reality is that these biases, though, they're all interconnected. They come down to really not being comfortable with people that are different than us. That is the reality, that we automatically go into alarm mode anytime something looks different. We can overcome that quickly, especially if we've done the work to identify it. And I use this example, and walking into a building, a storefront, it doesn't matter, in downtown Denver, like many inner cities, we're having issues and challenges with the unhoused. And I know data statistically, I read all the articles, I'm in there's no more danger by walking by someone who's standing at a door front than walking by anyone else standing in front of that door front. But no matter what, I'll take like this long path in to try to avoid that individual. And so this comes down to, we can teach ourselves, we can tell ourselves, but we go back to these instinctual behaviors. So we look for the cognitive biases that are connected to that is instinctual behaviors. And you're on mute.
My dog was speaking as well. So you mentioned Inclusify as an assessment that's part of that phase, and that seems like it's an individual assessment, and obviously with the leadership team, but are there scorecards or surveys to see how your company is performing on the DE&I spectrum beyond like the demographics of your workforce?
Yes, and there's platforms that do scorecards, usually embedded in HR, that's usually embedded within an HR part of the organization. For us though, on Inclusify, you do get an individual score, but you also get a score for your cohort. So for example, when we did a chairs group, I think we have several Vistage chairs going right now, they can learn about themselves, but then see the tendencies and follies within the group itself. And, you know, at times you could be the outlier where you have a completely different folly, and that makes total sense to you because you don't see eye to eye on some of these matters with your colleagues. Or what we tend to see, especially in cultures that amplify belonging over uniqueness, meaning that, you know, got to be part of the culture, you know, everyone kind of dresses and looks the same, you know, there's this kind of need for that. We find especially in those places a lot of blind spots about people not feeling like they can bring their full authentic self. So you can begin to see how an individual's team score is actually reflective of the full organization, especially when it mirrors what's at the top.
Interesting. Okay. Well, you've mentioned a lot about the Vistage cohorts and some of the chairs. Can you talk a little bit about the results you've seen when the work that you've done with some of our different cohorts within Vistage?
Yes. So first of all, I will always put the preface that this is it's called the journey to inclusive leadership because we're under no false assumption that we can have, you know, immediate impact. It's really going to take a lot of work if I'm being totally transparent. But here's what I've seen. One, the idea around meritocracy and equity has been a huge outcome. You know, for so long, we've been taught about the importance of hard work and you know, you work hard, you know, it doesn't matter who you are, what your background is, you can get anything you want. It's really transformational with people that go through this program to understand why that is not fully the case. Hard work, dedication, merit, those have a place, but they're actually problematic when we're talking about equity issues because it's not pulling in the unique journey. You know, I think about working moms. I use this example a lot, you know, professional women, the same hard work, the same hour, you know, it doesn't look the same. There's different expectations. And so, you know, it's really important. So with Vistage in particular, those conversations around equity and meritocracy have been so powerful as a potential blind spot for us to be inclusive leaders. And I would say the second really big outcome has been the powerful conversations among chairs and people going through it. They're making deeper connections with themselves. I mean, they're sharing about their childhood, their background, they're establishing greater trust than existed before. And why that is so important is we have to trust one another if we are going to put forth efforts around DE&I that are going to stick. And because we come into this vulnerable, because we come in it willing to be active and work, there's trust that we're in this to really build something sustainable. And that is a huge win. I've seen some chairs connect afterwards, have initiatives. I've seen a lot of the female chairs speak up and, you know, give great insight. And some of the male chairs really take into account what they're sharing, maybe for the first time. Very powerful.
Oh, that is powerful. Yeah. I love the exercise that you made us do with the affinity bias. And I went back and to my prior career in newspapers, and I remember meeting the general manager of one of our a TV stations, so effectively a competitor for both news and advertising. And then once I understood he was a Penn State graduate, all of a sudden it just shifted my perspective, right? You talk about, you know, all of a sudden we were the same instead of different, and we were on the same side instead of different sides. So it's really powerful when you think about how much affinity bias you're seeking out what you have in common with someone to really be able
Right.
to be connected.
Last name. I mean, think about it. Well, it's easy for me to meet another Martinez, but I mean, honestly, when I used to travel a lot for work, we were talking about travel earlier. When I used to travel, when you'd be in airports and you're in these zones, I mean, any little signal that there's some similarity there just takes away all of the fear you might have had. Now, imagine why that's so critically important, because we have the unknown, right? Until we kind of see similarities, and we don't get to see similarities if we don't open up conversations. And so that's what I love most about this work, is that people get to share probably parts of themselves maybe they never thought they would, but I can find commonality in just about everyone if I know how to search for it. And that is what this program really teaches, is how do we search for those similarities instead of always looking for the differences.
Interesting. Fascinating. In the history of DE&I, do you find that in all the research there might be businesses in certain industries or regions that are further ahead or behind in their journey?
Not really. I mean, I think there's companies who are more innovative, have probably are maybe further advanced in the work. But honestly, I would have to just be totally transparent that once we start getting in there and we start kind of unpacking things, unfortunately, there's still a lot underneath that has to be worked out in order for this stuff to be sustainable. I think that there are some companies now with some female CEOs or some different CEOs that are really pushing their organizations faster because they have every desire to help be part of the solution. But the reality is that even women who come into the workplace are bringing the biases, the stereotypes, the microaggressions. And so for us to think it's a them versus us problem is not going to solve this. And I still think that most organizations are approaching it as a them versus us, compliance based. And it's just not gonna, we're not gonna get those aspirational goals achieved if we stay in that lane.
True. Very true. Any resources before I thank you and let you enjoy your Friday? Are there any additional resources you could direct our attendees to?
We'll definitely go to latinoslead.org. We have a DE&I tab, not only information about this program, but some of the research and work that's gone into it. You can simply Google Inclusify and you can read the research that's built behind that. And as I mentioned, books like Everyday Bias, the Harvard IAT test, and some of these things readily at your disposal. And I would definitely say, be curious, be open to it. And if you're really interested in moving this forward, contact us and we'll see what we can do with you.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights and all the work that you're doing for Vistage and our community and small and mid-sized businesses. Really appreciate your time, Joelle.
Appreciate it, Ann, and thank you to Vistage for having me.
So for our attendees, we'll be sending a link to today's recording and the slides within 24 hours from now. Our next webinar for our Vistage members, Rethinking Happiness, is on November 19th in collaboration with the Stanford Graduate School of Business. For additional DE&I resources, I also encourage you to visit the Vistage Diversity and Inclusion Resource Center at vistage.com/DEI resource. And that includes information about our webinar on December 3rd, also in partnership with Stanford Graduate School of Business, that is on creating inclusive workspaces to drive innovation. So continuing on this topic. Then our final webinar of the year will be on December 10th, and it is Outlook 2022, 3 key themes that will drive your business. And it's a financial markets outlook with Adrienne Cronier of Ballantine, one of Vistage's speakers of the year, I believe for 2020. So you'll have the opportunity to hear from Adrienne in that session. Lastly, I just want to note, I'm very excited. I mentioned Pat Lencioni earlier. He is coming exclusively for our community. So for our members, please mark your calendar for January 7th, when we'll have an exclusive session with Pat. We'll talk about 3 steps for engaging your teams. You can find more information and register for these webinars at vistage.com/webinar. That's vistage.com/webinar. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day, be safe, and be well.